At my son's funeral, I was standing near his casket when my daughter-in-law leaned close enough that I could feel her breath on my ear. She whispered, "You're overreacting. You were never really family." I didn't look at her. I didn't answer. I just stood there holding the funeral program, so tight the edge cut my palm. By the next morning, she was the one who'd lost everything. Before I tell you my story, please make sure to like and subscribe to support the channel. Also, let me know how your day is going and where you're from. Thanks. I never thought I would stand at my own son's funeral and feel like the one person who is truly alone. They were lowering David's casket into the ground when Sarah leaned in so close I could see the tiny crack in her lipstick and whispered, "You're overreacting. You were never really family." I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the wooden box and tried to pretend I hadn't heard her, even though the words lodged under my ribs like a piece of glass. Around me, people shifted and sniffled and murmured about what a good man David had been. He'd been the kind of man who called me every Sunday, who always hugged me first at gatherings, who still left birthday cards in my kitchen even after he got married. But now he was gone, and Sarah was already acting like I was an inconvenience she'd been forced to tolerate. I felt my hand tighten around the funeral program until the edge bit into my skin, but I didn't say a word. When the service ended, Sarah wiped her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief and stepped into a little circle of her work friends, talking in a low voice that stopped the second I got too close. I didn't try to join them. I stood off to the side, clutching my purse like it might keep me from floating away. A man I didn't recognize handed me a single white rose and told me I should take care of myself. I nodded, even though I didn't feel like I existed enough to do anything. When it was over, Sarah walked up to me, calm as anything, and put a hand on my shoulder. "I'll drive you home," she said in a tone that made it clear it wasn't a favor. I got in the passenger seat of David's old car and stared straight ahead, the smell of his cologne still clinging to the fabric. Neither of us spoke on the way back. When we pulled into the driveway, she didn't wait for me to get out. She killed the engine and turned to me with her wedding ring glinting against the steering wheel. "I've decided it's best if you start looking for somewhere else to stay," she said, like she was suggesting I try a new shampoo. "I'm listing the house on Monday. You'll have 48 hours once the paperwork is filed." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My ears were ringing, and my tongue felt thick. She tilted her head and looked almost sympathetic. "It's just too much space now. I need a clean start." I still couldn't form words, so I reached for the door handle and climbed out. My legs felt like they might give out, but I didn't let them. I walked inside, and the first thing I saw was a cardboard box in the hallway with Mom's room scrolled across it in Sarah's handwriting. I went straight to my bedroom, which didn't even feel like mine anymore. The framed photo of David and me at his college graduation was gone from the nightstand. The quilt I'd made years ago was folded on the floor. In its place, a realtor's folder sat on the bed, open to a page that read, "Pre-listing checklist." I sat down slowly and picked it up, reading every line like maybe I'd misunderstood, like maybe this was some mix-up I could undo by being reasonable. But I knew better. I knew Sarah had been waiting for this. When David first asked me to move in after my husband died, she'd pasted on a smile and told me it would be so nice to have family around, but it never really was. She liked things quiet and spotless in hers, and I was always one too many reminders that the house didn't belong to just her. I put the folder back exactly where I'd found it and started pulling my things from the dresser. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. Around 7, I heard her moving around the kitchen, her voice low, and even as she answered condolence calls on speakerphone. "Thank you." "Yes, we're doing as well as can be expected," she kept saying, like she was the only one grieving. I stayed in my room, taping up boxes, folding clothes, trying not to think about how fast everything had turned. At some point, I realized I'd been packing for hours without stopping. My back hurt, and my mouth was dry. I went to the kitchen for water, and she looked up from her laptop, like she'd forgotten I was still in the house. She didn't say anything, just watched me fill a glass and drink it in one long swallow. When I set it down, she sighed. "I know this is difficult, Mary, but it's for the best." David would want me to be able to move on. I looked her straight in the eye for the first time that day. You don't get to decide what he would have wanted, I said, my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. She blinked, her face blank. Then she turned back to her laptop, ending the conversation as if she hadn't just gutted the last bit of dignity I had left. I went back to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the stripped bed. I thought about all the little things David used to do. How he'd make sure my favorite coffee creamer was in the fridge. How he'd leave notes on the counter when he worked late. None of it mattered now. All that was left was this cold, empty house and the woman who couldn't even wait until he was in the ground before she started erasing me. I didn't cry. I don't know why. Maybe because crying would have meant admitting she'd won. Instead, I stood up, picked up my phone, and called the only person I could think of, Evelyn, David's old coworker, the one who'd hugged me extra long at the funeral. When she picked up, I didn't even say hello. I just said, I think I need help. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, I'm on my way. And for the first time all day, I felt like maybe I wasn't completely alone. I didn't move from the edge of that bed for a long time after I hung up the phone with Evelyn. My mind kept replaying the way Sarah's voice sounded when she said I was never really family, like it was something she'd been saving up for years. I stared at the half-filled boxes and the taped-up folder she'd left on my bed and thought about how it had all started with one decision I thought was the right thing. 8 years ago, David called me one evening sounding embarrassed. He said they were trying to buy the house, but the bank wanted a bigger down payment, and they'd been turned down for a loan extension. He didn't ask outright, but I could hear it in his voice. I had sold the house I shared with my husband when he passed, and most of the money was still sitting in a savings account I hadn't touched. I told David I would help, and he argued at first, but I insisted. I said I'd never need a big house again, and that it was only right that his family be stable. So, I transferred the funds to cover the shortfall, and we signed a deed naming me as a partial owner. He was so grateful he hugged me in the middle of the bank office. I remember Sarah sitting in the corner scrolling her phone, acting like it was all routine. Later that night, David brought me a bottle of sparkling cider and a little cake that said, "Our family home" in blue icing. He kept the receipt from the cashier's check and the deed paperwork in a folder he labeled Home Documents. He told me he'd always make sure I had a place here. That was the last time I ever felt fully welcome. Thinking about it now, sitting there in that stripped-down bedroom, I realized that folder might be the only thing standing between me and Sarah tossing me out with the trash. I picked up my purse and went to the garage door, but it was locked from the inside. I tried the code panel, but the numbers beeped and then flashed red. She changed it already. My stomach clenched, but I didn't have time to panic. I checked the side gate, and when I eased it open, I slipped into the garage and flicked on the overhead light. The filing cabinet was still against the far wall where David kept it. I crouched down and started pulling open drawers, my heart beating so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. I found insurance papers, tax records, old car titles, nothing that mattered. The last drawer stuck halfway, and I had to brace my foot against the cabinet to wrench it open. Inside, under a stack of outdated warranty guides, was a brown accordion folder with a rubber band around it. I flipped it open, and there it was. Deed papers with both our names, the cashier's check receipt with the amount written in David's neat handwriting, and the settlement statements. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped it. I shoved the folder into my purse and stood up just as the door to the kitchen swung open. Sarah was standing there in her black slacks and a blouse like she was about to go to a meeting. Her eyes flicked from my face to the purse. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, her voice so cold it didn't even sound surprised. "I'm getting my things," I said, trying to keep my voice even. She stepped forward, stopping just inside the doorway. "That's private property." I looked her in the eye. "I own part of this house. Nothing in here is off-limits to me." She didn't argue. She just stared at me for a long moment, her mouth pressed in a tight line. "You need to leave," she finally said. "Tonight." I didn't answer. I walked past her, back through the kitchen and into the front hallway. My hands were sweating around the straps of my purse. I didn't want her to see the folder, but I knew she suspected. I was halfway to the door when the doorbell rang. For 1 second, we both froze. Then she moved to open it, her hand smooth on the knob like she was controlling the whole situation. Standing on the porch was Evelyn, wearing jeans and a simple cardigan. She held a paper grocery bag in one arm and looked directly at me, not Sarah. "Hi, Mary," she said quietly. "Can I come in?" Sarah stepped in front of the doorway, blocking her. "This isn't a good time," she said, her voice shifting into that polite tone she used when she was being fake. Evelyn didn't look at her. She just kept her eyes on me. "I think it's exactly the right time," she said, and the certainty in her voice made something in my chest loosen. I nodded once. Sarah looked from me to her, then back again. "Fine," she muttered, stepping aside. Evelyn came in and set the bag on the hall table. "I brought you something," she said. She reached into the bag and pulled out a small flash drive in a clear Ziploc. She held it out. "David asked me to give you this if anything ever happened to him." My breath caught. "When did he?" She didn't let me finish. "A few months ago, he told me he was updating his will and some personal files. He didn't say why." Sarah's eyes narrowed, but she didn't say anything. I took the drive and closed my hand around it, feeling the edges dig into my skin. "Thank you," I whispered. Evelyn nodded. "I'll wait outside," she said, and she walked back onto the porch without looking at Sarah again. The second she was gone, Sarah's mask slipped. "You're pathetic," she hissed, running to his friends for help. "You think some USB is going to change anything?" I didn't reply. I walked past her, down the hall, and into my room. I shoved the folder deeper into my purse, zipped it shut, and grabbed my suitcase. I heard Sarah's voice following me like a mosquito. "You're leaving? Where will you even go?" I kept walking. "You can't stay here," she called after me. "You'll regret this." I didn't look back. At the front door, I paused to catch my breath, my hand tight on the doorknob. I turned my head just enough to see her standing there with her arms crossed. "You're right about one thing," I said, my voice steady. "I'm leaving tonight." Then I stepped out onto the porch and shut the door behind me. Evelyn was waiting by her car, and she opened the passenger door without a word. I slid in, set my purse on my lap, and finally let out the breath I'd been holding since the funeral. We didn't speak much on the drive to the motel. I held the flash drive in my palm like it was the last piece of David I had left. When we pulled into the parking lot, Evelyn parked and turned to me. "If you need anything, you call me," she said firmly. "Anything at all?" I nodded, unable to get my throat to work. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "He deserved better." I swallowed hard. We both did. She waited until I was inside before she drove away. The room was small, just a bed, a table, and a lamp, but it was the first place I'd been all day that didn't feel like it belonged to Sarah. I sat on the bed and pulled my laptop from my suitcase. My hands were still shaking as I plugged in the flash drive and opened the only file on it, a video labeled for Mom. The screen flickered, and there was David sitting at his desk wearing the blue button-down I'd given him for Christmas. He looked tired. "If you're watching this," he began, his voice rough, "it means I'm gone, and I'm sorry for that. I need you to know something important." I pressed my fist to my mouth to keep from making a sound. He took a breath. "I've been trying to protect you, but I don't think I did enough. Sarah has been hiding things. Debts. She used my name to take out a line of credit on the house. I found out last month. I was going to talk to you, but..." He looked away, then back. "If she tries to force you out, don't let her. You have rights. The deed is still in your name. Get help if you need it." "I'm sorry I didn't do more." The screen went black, and I sat there staring at my own reflection, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. All the anger and grief twisted together into something that felt like resolve. I closed the laptop and pressed my hand over the folder in my purse. She thought she could erase me, but she didn't know what David had left behind. And I wasn't going to let her take anything else. When the video ended, I just sat there holding the laptop like it was the last piece of David I'd ever have. My mouth felt dry, and I couldn't remember when I'd last eaten anything. I forced myself to close the computer, then pulled the brown folder from my purse and laid everything out on the motel bed. The deed, the cashier's check receipt, the settlement statement, and the flash drive. My hands were still shaking, but at least now I had something solid, something Sarah couldn't just dismiss. I picked up my phone and scrolled to the contact David had once insisted I save years back, a lawyer named Ben Garcia. He'd helped David with some employment contract dispute, and I remembered David saying he was trustworthy. My thumb hovered over the call button for a long time before I finally pressed it. The receptionist who answered sounded so polite, it made my throat tighten. I explained who I was and why I was calling, my voice coming out thin and scratchy. She told me Mr. Garcia was in court that morning, but could see me by early afternoon. I gave her the name of the motel, hung up, and then just stared at the ceiling, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do for the next 4 hours. Eventually, I made myself go to the front desk to ask if there was a place nearby to get coffee. The young man behind the counter handed me a paper map without looking up from his screen. I walked 2 blocks to a little diner and ordered toast and coffee. But when the plate came, I couldn't swallow more than a few bites. My stomach felt like it was knotted in wet rope. I kept thinking about David's face in that video. The way he couldn't even look straight at the camera when he said he hadn't done enough. He'd spent so much of his life trying to keep other people happy. And now I was the last person left to defend the promises he'd made. When it was finally time for my appointment, I gathered everything into my purse. I checked the room 3 times to be sure I hadn't left any paper behind, and called a cab. The ride to the law office felt longer than it probably was. I watched out the window without really seeing anything. When we pulled up, I paid the driver and sat there for a minute with the door open, my hand pressed to the folder in my lap. Part of me still felt like maybe I was making a mistake, that maybe Sarah was right, and I was overreacting, that grief was clouding my judgment. But then I thought of her voice the night before, calling me pathetic and telling me I'd regret leaving. I took a breath, climbed out, and walked into the building. The receptionist gave me a polite nod and offered me water while I waited. I declined and sat in the corner chair, clutching my purse like it was an anchor. A few minutes later, a door opened and a tall man in a gray suit stepped out and called my name. He had the kind of face that didn't show much, but his eyes softened when he looked at me. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Ben Garcia. Let's go talk." I followed him into his office, which was neat and lined with framed degrees. He gestured for me to sit, then settled into the chair across from me. "I'm very sorry for your loss," he began, his voice calm. I nodded, feeling something in my chest twist again. "Thank you," I whispered. He waited, giving me time to collect myself. Then he said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about David dying, about the funeral, about Sarah whispering that I was never really family, about the eviction notice, the locks changed, the threats, and the things she said when she thought no one was listening. I told him about the brown folder, the deed, the cashier's check, and the video David had left for me. When I finally stopped talking, my throat was raw, and my hands were cramped from how tightly I'd been holding them in my lap. Mr. Garcia didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he leaned forward and said, "May I see the documents in the video?" I passed them across the desk with a hand that felt like it didn't belong to me. He opened the folder and studied each page carefully, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When he finished reading, he sat back and looked me straight in the eye. "You have a very strong position here," he said evenly. "Your name is on the deed. You have proof of financial contribution. Her attempt to evict you isn't legally valid." I felt something loosen in my chest, but before I could exhale, he held up a finger. "However," he said, "she may still try to force your hand by creating a narrative of instability. If she files an emergency motion claiming you're a threat or unfit, a judge could issue a temporary removal order." My mouth went dry. "She already said she'd make me look unstable," I whispered. He nodded once. "That's often how it goes. But you have documentation. The video is critical. It shows David acknowledged your rights and anticipated she might do this. That will carry weight." He set the papers down carefully. "The next step is to file a notice of intent to retain occupancy and a motion to preemptively block any sale or transfer of title." He looked at me again, steady. Do you want to proceed? My chest felt tight, but I nodded. Yes, I said.
My voice didn't shake that time.
He leaned over and picked up the phone on his desk, giving brief instructions to someone in the next room. When he hung up, he turned back to me. We'll draft everything today. In the meantime, I need you to stay somewhere secure. Do not return to that house alone. If she contacts you, record everything. I swallowed. She has my things, my clothes, some of David's things. He paused, considering. We'll include a request for retrieval of personal property under supervision that will likely be granted. My eyes stung, but I blinked hard. Thank you, I managed. He reached over and touched the folder gently. You did the right thing coming here. For a second, I thought I might cry, but I pressed my palm flat against my thigh and forced the feeling down. He stood and walked me out to the lobby, telling me he'd be in touch by the end of the day. The receptionist gave me a small, encouraging smile as I left. When I got back to the motel, I locked the door behind me and set the folder down on the little table. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling so tired I didn't think I could move again. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with myself while I waited. So I did the only thing I could think of. I called Evelyn. When she answered, I said, I saw the lawyer. My voice came out flat. He said, I have a case. I knew you would, she replied quietly. How are you holding up? That question almost undid me. I don't know, I admitted. There was a long pause. Then she said, Do you want company? I thought about it, then shook my head even though she couldn't see me. Not right now. All right, she said. Call me if you change your mind. After I hung up, I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The edges of my vision felt blurry, like I was underwater. For a little while, I tried to remember what it felt like to live in that house before Sarah started acting like I was some burden she had to tolerate. I thought about the night David called to tell me Leo was born. How happy he'd sounded. How sure he was that everything was finally coming together. I pressed my hand over my eyes and told myself I wouldn't cry, but the tears came anyway, slow and hot and unstoppable. I cried for David, for Leo, for the life that had slipped away piece by piece while I kept telling myself I was doing the right thing by staying quiet. When I finally sat up, my head felt hollow. I wiped my face with a corner of the sheet and took a deep breath. There was a voicemail from Mr. Garcia. His voice was calm but firm. I've filed the emergency motion. She'll be served by morning. Stay where you are. You're doing everything right. I set the phone down and closed my eyes. I told myself that was enough for today, that tonight I could just be a mother who missed her son. Tomorrow I would be the woman who made sure Sarah couldn't erase me. The next morning started with a call I almost ignored. I had barely slept, lying there with David's video over and over in my head. When the phone buzzed, I thought it was Evelyn checking on me again, but the screen showed a number I didn't recognize. I answered anyway, my voice rough. The man on the other end introduced himself as a deputy marshal from the county sheriff's office. He said he was calling as a courtesy to let me know that the injunction Mr. Garcia filed had been granted and that an officer would serve Sarah with the notice that morning. I thanked him, my hand pressed tight over my eyes as he explained what the papers included. She was legally barred from selling or transferring the property, and any attempt to evict me without further court order was prohibited. When I hung up, I didn't feel relief. Exactly. It was more like the tension in my shoulders shifted to a different kind of heaviness. The weight of knowing this was far from over. I got up and made myself eat a few crackers from the vending machine, then sat back on the bed to think. I knew Sarah wouldn't take this quietly. She'd already made it clear she thought of me as an obstacle she could sweep aside, and this would feel to her like losing control. Sure enough, less than 2 hours later, my phone lit up with her name. I let it ring. When she called again, I turned the phone off completely. I knew better than to give her the chance to record me or twist my words. Instead, I called Mr. Garcia's office to confirm that the filing had been completed, and his assistant told me that not only had the injunction gone through, but the court had also scheduled a hearing for the following week to formalize the status of my claim. She sounded almost cheerful when she said it, but I didn't feel anything like cheerful. I hung up and stared at the folded receipt from the cashier's check, remembering how proud David had been the day we signed the papers, how he'd told me that we'd made something permanent together. The idea that Sarah had spent years planning to cut me out made my stomach twist. Part of me still wondered if she'd always resented me or if it was something that grew slowly over time, fed by all the little compromises and resentments that build up in a marriage until there's no kindness left. I didn't have long to think about it. Around noon, Evelyn called. Her voice was low and urgent. She asked if I was sitting down. I told her yes, bracing for something worse. She said she'd just seen a post Sarah made on social media, a long message full of carefully chosen words. Sarah had posted a black and white photo of David holding Leo as a baby. In the caption, she wrote about how grief was bringing out the worst in some people, how she was being threatened and harassed, how she feared for her child's safety because certain family members refused to respect boundaries. She never mentioned my name, but she didn't have to. Anyone who knew us would connect the dots. Evelyn read part of it aloud, her voice tight with disgust, and when she finished, I felt like someone had pressed a cold hand against my spine. I thanked her for letting me know and promised I'd stay put. After we hung up, I opened the motel Wi-Fi and pulled up the post. There it was, already gathering comments from Sarah's friends and coworkers. People were writing things like, "You're so strong and nobody deserves this, and let us know if you need help." I scrolled and saw one that made me close the laptop. Some people can't let go of control even when it's time to move on. For a moment, I felt something close to rage, but underneath it was something worse. The quiet shame that comes when you realize people will believe whatever story sounds easiest. I pressed my hand flat against the table and took a deep breath. I knew if I tried to argue with her publicly, it would look petty. That was how she operated. She provoked people into reacting so she could point to their reaction as proof she was the victim. I sat there thinking about what David would have wanted me to do. He wouldn't have wanted me to hide, but he also wouldn't have wanted me to stoop to her level. When the phone rang again, it was Mr. Garcia this time. He said he'd seen the post, too, and wanted to advise me not to engage. He said the best way to counter a public narrative like that was with evidence, calmly presented, not emotion. I told him I understood, and for the first time in days, I felt steadier. Before we hung up, he asked if I'd considered speaking to the local news outlet. He said sometimes having an impartial record of the facts could help. I hadn't thought about it, but the longer I sat there, the more it seemed like the only way to counter the story she was telling. I told him I'd think about it. After we hung up, I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for the local paper. My finger hovered over it for a long time. Part of me hated the idea of making something so personal public. But then I remembered the way Sarah had looked at me in the kitchen, her mouth curling when she called me pathetic. She was counting on me to stay quiet, so I pressed the call button. The reporter who answered sounded young, but she listened carefully as I explained what was happening. She didn't interrupt or rush me. When I finished, she asked if I had documentation. I told her I did. She asked if I'd be willing to share it. I hesitated for a heartbeat, then said yes. She offered to come meet me that afternoon. After I hung up, I felt my heart hammering so hard I thought I might be sick, but I didn't have time to fall apart. I laid everything out on the table, checking it twice to be sure I hadn't left anything out. The reporter arrived just after 3. Her name was Marissa, and she was polite but serious. She asked me to walk her through everything start to finish. I did, my voice flat, while she took notes and recorded. She examined the deed and the receipt, looked at the flash drive, and asked if she could take photos for verification. When I agreed, she thanked me for being thorough. She told me she'd reach out to Sarah for comment before the piece ran. I knew that would only make Sarah angrier, but I didn't care anymore. By the time Marissa left, it was getting late. I watched her drive away, then closed the curtains and sat on the bed, feeling more tired than I ever had. My phone buzzed with a new voicemail. It was Sarah's voice, brittle and low. She said, "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're destroying what's left of this family. If you care about Leo at all, you'll stop this now." I played it twice, then forwarded it to Mr. Garcia without replying. For a long time after that, I just sat there staring at the wall. I thought about the day David brought Leo home from the hospital, how Sarah had let me hold him first, like she trusted me back then. I thought about all the dinners where she'd smiled across the table, all the times I'd convinced myself that if I stayed out of the way, we'd be okay. I thought about how none of it mattered. Now, when the phone buzzed again, I didn't even look. I picked it up, powered it off, and set it face down. That night, I lay on the stiff motel bed, my mind looping through every moment that had brought me here. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt hollow. But underneath that emptiness was a thin, steady line of something stronger. The knowledge that for the first time in years, I wasn't letting someone else decide what I was allowed to keep. I pulled the covers up and told myself tomorrow I'd be ready for whatever Sarah tried next. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Mr. Garcia saying the newspaper article would go live by noon and that I should be prepared for fallout. I sat on the edge of the bed with my phone in my hand, thinking about how strange it was that something as simple as telling the truth could feel like a risk. My stomach felt sour, but I got up and dressed, making sure I had every document and copy secured in my purse. I knew Sarah would see the article and try to spin it her way. But I also knew there wasn't much she could say to contradict hard proof. I made myself eat half a granola bar, though I barely tasted it. Around 10, Evelyn called. She didn't say good morning or ask how I was. She just said, "It's up." My heart gave a painful thump, but I nodded even though she couldn't see me. I pulled up the website, and there it was, the headline in big black letters: "Grieving mother fights eviction after son's death." They'd used a photo of David and me at his college graduation, the same one Sarah had taken off my nightstand. Seeing it made my throat close up, but I forced myself to read every word. The article was thorough. It explained the deed, the funds I'd contributed, and the timeline of Sarah's eviction attempt. It quoted Mr. Garcia confirming my legal standing and mentioned that Sarah had declined to comment, except to say she was focused on protecting her family's future. When I finished reading, I felt something I hadn't in weeks, a small, hard spark of relief. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't making this up. I had done everything I could to protect what David and I had built. But the relief didn't last long because less than an hour later, my phone started ringing over and over with numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored them all, but the notifications kept stacking up. By noon, Evelyn texted to warn me that Sarah had started posting again. This time, she'd filmed a video in the living room, sitting on the couch with Leo beside her. She was crying, saying she didn't know why I was trying to ruin their lives, that she was just a widow trying to care for her child. She said she'd always welcomed me into their home, and that she didn't understand why I was turning on her now. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to set the phone down on the table. I wanted to scream that she was lying, that she was the one who'd turned, but I knew it wouldn't matter. People believed the story that was easiest to feel sorry for. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe past the ache in my chest. I didn't care what strangers thought of me, but I cared that Leo was sitting there hearing her say those things. I called Mr. Garcia and told him about the video. He sighed and said this was predictable, that she was trying to sway public sympathy before the hearing. He reminded me that I didn't have to respond publicly, that I already had the truth on my side. After we hung up, I felt so tired I could hardly stand, but I forced myself to get dressed properly, to brush my hair, to look like a person who wasn't about to collapse. Around 2, my phone buzzed again, but this time it was Deputy Marshal. He told me Sarah had been formally served with the injunction and that I had the right to return to the property if I wished, accompanied by an officer to ensure no disturbance. The thought of going back into that house made my stomach twist, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. My things were still there, and part of me felt like if I didn't go back, it would be the same as admitting she'd won. I thanked him and said I would come that afternoon. I called a cab, and when it arrived, I climbed in, clutching my purse like it was a life preserver. The driver didn't say anything, and I was grateful for the silence. When we pulled into the neighborhood, I felt my throat tighten. The house looked exactly the same as it always had, except now I could see Sarah's car parked out front along with a black SUV I didn't recognize. I paid the driver and got out slowly. Before I could second-guess myself, a patrol car pulled up behind me. Deputy Marshal stepped out, his expression neutral. "You ready, ma'am?" he asked. I nodded, though my palms were sweating. Together, we walked up the path. He knocked on the door firmly, and after a long pause, it opened. Sarah stood there, her face pale and tight. For a second, none of us spoke. Then she stepped back and crossed her arms. "You can come in," she said flatly. I walked past her into the foyer, trying to ignore the way her eyes followed every movement. Inside, the house felt smaller than I remembered, crowded with boxes and piles of things I didn't recognize. The deputy cleared his throat. "Mrs. Wilson is here to collect personal belongings and document property," he said. Sarah didn't answer. She just turned and walked into the kitchen. I went to my old room first. Someone had emptied the drawers onto the bed, and I had to sift through everything piece by piece to find what was mine. My hands were shaking, but I made myself keep going. I packed my clothes, the framed photos, the little jewelry box David had given me. When I got to the bottom of the closet, I found the quilt I'd made crumpled in a ball like it was nothing. I folded it carefully and set it in the suitcase. As I worked, I could hear Sarah moving around in the kitchen, opening and closing cabinets. I didn't care what she was doing as long as she stayed out of my way. When I finished in the bedroom, I walked down the hall to the study. The door was ajar, and I pushed it open slowly. Inside, everything looked the same as it had when David was alive. His books lined the shelves, his papers stacked neatly on the desk. My throat tightened as I stepped inside. I wanted to take something of his, something that felt like him. On the desk was a small wooden box I didn't recognize. I opened it carefully and found a folded envelope with my name written in David's handwriting. My vision blurred, but I didn't open it there. I slipped it into my purse, feeling the weight of it settle against everything else I'd carried. When I turned to leave, I found Sarah standing in the doorway. Her face was unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked down at the floor and said, "I don't know why you're doing this." Her voice was shaky. "I'm just trying to survive." I felt something in me flicker. But it wasn't pity. It was exhaustion. "You're trying to survive by erasing me," I said quietly. She lifted her chin, her eyes bright. "You never belonged here." My hand tightened on the strap of my purse. "You're wrong," I said. "I belonged here before you ever did." She didn't reply. She just turned and walked away. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, then stepped past her into the hall. Deputy Marshal met me at the door. "All set?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes." He waited as I zipped the last suitcase. Then he carried it out to the porch for me. As we stepped outside, I heard Sarah's voice behind me. "You'll regret this," she called, her voice shaking. I didn't turn around. I walked to the curb and waited while he loaded everything into the cab. Before I got in, I looked back one last time at the house I'd thought would be my home for the rest of my life. It didn't feel like mine anymore. It hadn't for a long time. I thanked the deputy, climbed into the back seat, and shut the door. As the car pulled away, I felt something in my chest loosen, like I'd finally stopped pretending. I didn't know what Sarah would do next, but for the first time in weeks, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to read David's letter, and then I was going to make sure she never had the chance to hurt me again. When I got back to the motel, I didn't unpack. I didn't sit down or take off my shoes. I went straight to the little table by the window, set my purse down, and pulled out the envelope with my name on it. My hands were shaking, but I made myself slide my finger under the flap and open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in half, David's handwriting filling the page in his neat block letters. I took a breath and started reading. He began by saying he was sorry he hadn't been braver sooner. He wrote that he'd known for a long time that Sarah had debts she was hiding, that she'd taken out credit cards in his name and had been moving money between accounts to keep up appearances. He said he'd thought he could fix it, that if he worked enough hours, he could catch up before it swallowed them whole. But he'd been tired, and he'd been scared to tell me because he knew how much I worried. He wrote that he never wanted me to feel like I was a burden. That moving me into the house had been something he wanted, not something he'd done out of obligation. He said he was proud of the way I'd rebuilt my life after Dad died, that he respected me more than I probably ever knew. I had to stop reading because the words were swimming on the page. I pressed my hand over my mouth, trying to keep the sob from escaping, but it came out anyway, a raw sound I couldn't control. For a moment, I let myself feel all of it. The grief, the guilt, the relief that at least he'd left me this one clear truth. When I could finally breathe again, I finished the letter. In the last lines, he asked me to promise I wouldn't let Sarah take everything. He said, "Don't let her convince you that you don't belong. You belong anywhere you decide you do." I folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. My chest hurt, but it felt different now, like something old was finally breaking apart, so something stronger could grow in its place. I wiped my face, then picked up my phone and turned it back on. There were more missed calls and messages, most from Sarah, a few from numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored them all. Instead, I called Mr. Garcia and told him I wanted to move forward with formal proceedings to reclaim my part of the property and to request restitution for damages and legal costs. He said he'd already prepared the paperwork. He sounded calm and certain, which helped steady me. After we hung up, I called Evelyn. When she picked up, I didn't try to pretend everything was fine. I read his letter. I said, my voice thick. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad he left you something real." I closed my eyes. Me too. I told her I was going to stay at the motel until the hearing. She offered to come sit with me, but I said I needed a little time alone first. She understood. That night, I packed up everything I didn't need, stacking my suitcases by the door. I kept only what was necessary: the folder with all my documents, the letter, and a change of clothes. I wanted to be ready for whatever came next. In the morning, I called the clerk's office to confirm the hearing date and time. When I hung up, I found myself staring at the framed picture of David I'd propped on the dresser. I thought about how proud he'd been the day we moved me in. How sure he was that this was the start of something good. It still made my heart ache, but it didn't feel like it was going to crush me anymore. Around midday, I decided it was time to answer at least one of the messages. I chose the oldest one, a voicemail Sarah had left before she started posting videos. Her voice was shaky but cold. She said, "I don't know what you think you're proving. All you're doing is hurting Leo. He doesn't understand why you're trying to take away his home." For a moment, I closed my eyes, trying to keep my temper from flaring. Leo was the only reason I'd hesitated about any of this, but I knew that letting Sarah have her way wasn't going to protect him in the long run. He deserved stability, not more lies. I didn't call her back. Instead, I called the family court clerk to ask about the process for seeking temporary guardianship. I knew it was a long shot, but I wanted to be ready. The clerk explained that it would require evidence that Sarah was unfit or unable to provide for him safely. I thanked her and wrote down everything she said. By the time I hung up, I felt calmer, like I finally had a plan. I spent the rest of the day organizing my papers, labeling every document so there wouldn't be any confusion in court. When I was done, I sat on the edge of the bed, reading David's letter again, letting his words fill up the empty spaces in me. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in weeks. In the morning, I woke up to another call from Mr. Garcia. He said Sarah had filed a motion to contest my claim, accusing me of forging David's signature on the deed. For a second, all the air seemed to leave the room. But then he said, "Don't worry. We have the original documents and the recording. She won't get far with this." I swallowed hard. She'll never stop, will she? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Probably not, but she doesn't get to decide the outcome." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, thinking about all the ways I'd let Sarah dictate what I felt. I thought about every time I'd bitten my tongue to keep the peace. Every time I'd convinced myself it was better not to push back. Not anymore. Around noon, I packed up everything and checked out of the motel. I called Evelyn to let her know I was coming by to leave copies of my documents with her just in case. She met me at her front door, her eyes kind but serious. When I handed her the folder, she rested her hand over mine. "You're doing the right thing," she said. I nodded. "I know." After that, I drove straight to the courthouse. I sat in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes before I finally made myself go inside. The clerk handed me a small stack of forms to sign, each one confirming my request for injunctive relief and reimbursement of costs. My hands didn't shake this time. When I finished, I walked out into the bright afternoon and felt like I was stepping into a version of myself I hadn't seen in years, one that wasn't afraid to stand up for what was rightfully hers. That evening, I sat in the small rented room I'd found for the next few weeks, and I read David's letter one more time. I thought about how much he'd tried to protect me even when he was too tired to protect himself. I thought about Leo and how one day he'd be old enough to understand the truth. I thought about Sarah and how she'd underestimated me from the start. And for the first time since David died, I felt something close to peace. I knew there were still battles ahead, but I also knew I wasn't going to fight them with fear anymore. I was going to fight them with every ounce of strength I had left. And no matter what Sarah did next, she was never going to take that away from me. That was my story. Please tell me, did I do the right thing or not?